I've often said the importance or the value of your calling is not whether you're in the ministry or not, but who called you. So if God called you to be a godly plumber or electrician or a school teacher, that's just as important, because not because of what you do so much, but because of who asked you to do it.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host. And helping take our leadership to the next level is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Well, Sam, it's an ongoing project, but I'm still working at it.
Well, I am a lifelong learner, so I'm happy to be a full-time project for you. And you've got your work cut out for you. I'll tell you that. But today we want to look at just dive right in here to leadership in the church and marketplace. And, I think if any of our listeners have been in church for any number of years, they'll know that there's a pretty big emphasis in the church, when someone feels a call into full-time ministry or to missions, and that should be rightly celebrated. But I think what's maybe often overlooked is the leaders that are going into the workplace and making a difference in their communities. And sometimes there's not really clear, there's not a real clear calling that the church places on those people. And maybe just how should pastors look at leaders in the marketplace? Yeah,
and I think if you've followed my speaking and travel very much, you know that probably half of the time I'm speaking, it's to marketplace leaders. And half to church leaders, and a lot of times in the same week, I'm speaking to both groups. And well,
that's why I had you on today, Richard, because I know this is really your niche here.
Yeah, and so and it's interesting when I'm in a room full of business leaders. They're typically involved in their churches, but a lot of times their pastors don't necessarily know what to do with them. And they often feel ill-equipped in their own local church. It's partly why people, I think I've shared, before, that I'm a part of one group that we do training at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport at the Grand Hyatt Hotel that's right there on site. And I just came from there the last couple of weeks. I've been there each week with a different group. And these folks fly in from all over the country for a 24-hour period. We start at lunch on Thursday. It ends at lunch on Friday. And in that 24-hour period, it's quite intensive with a lot of teaching and case studies and various things. And these folks, they go to church, but they still don't feel like their church necessarily equips them the way they feel they need to be for the workplace. And so they join groups like this, and they travel across the country. I think I mentioned before, but in an earlier group that I did a couple of years ago, we actually had a business exec who flew from Hong Kong to Dallas 10 times. This particular group has 10 meetings, and he flew from Hong Kong to Dallas 10 times just to get training that he couldn't get in his local church. And so I think this is an important issue. And so I want to just kind of walk through some of the things that, just observations, I think. So whether you're a pastor listening to this or you're a business person, a professional, I think that this can apply. And so first one just is that all are called, not just missionaries and pastors. And I remember the day that I felt called into a ministry track. I was 18 or so years old, and felt like God was calling me, and I sensed it was at that time to be a pastor. And of course, that's a big deal, and churches celebrate. And in my church and the culture I grew up in, that was certainly celebrated because in some sense we feel like, hey, if you're called to be a pastor, then you're real serious about your walk with God. I mean, you're willing to go to great lengths for Him and to study and prepare and to represent God each day and to expand His kingdom. And those are all very noble undertakings. But if you just felt called to go get an MBA and go into management in a local factory or something, we're glad that you're going to be a responsible Christian adult and provide for your family and tithe to the church, but the real super spiritual ones are the ones that became missionaries and moved to Ethiopia or something. And I think people are beginning to realize, well, everyone is called. I mean, God has a purpose for every life, and clearly he doesn't intend for every person to be a pastor or a missionary, at least not in the traditional sense. And so God equally calls you. It's not a lesser call. I mean, I've often said the importance or the value of your calling is not whether you're in the ministry or not, but who called you. So if God called you to be a godly plumber or electrician or a school teacher, that's just as important, because not because of what you do so much, but because of who asked you to do it.
Right.
And if God has a purpose for you, then you embrace that. And Martin Luther, back in the Reformation, was one of those who really highlighted that and said you can bring just as much glory to God as a bricklayer doing it for the glory of God than a priest or a minister could bring glory to God. And so it's how you do it. If you do everything unto the Lord, then you glorify God as well. And so I think we rightly celebrate people that feel called to ministry. That's a hard undertaking. It usually doesn't pay nearly as well as other callings.
Yeah.
It does mean that you're living in a glass house and observed and scrutinized to perhaps a greater degree, and it means that you're trying to minister in an increasingly secularized society that rejects a lot of what we teach and believe. So that's not an easy calling for sure, and we ought to be grateful for every person that surrenders to that call. But I think the church also needs to celebrate when people clearly feel called into being a professional of some sort or a business person. And I think even as we like to celebrate and bring people forward that have surrendered to the call to ministry, as we call it, I think we should also celebrate when people step up and say, I feel called into law school to be a Christian attorney, or to be a Christian nurse or a Christian teacher, a Christian business person. And so I think the key is just, what is it that God's called you to do? If I were a pastor today, I remember when I was a pastor, I always gave special attention to the young people, the teenagers, the college students. And I wasn't trying to pressure them to be pastors, but I kept asking them, but what do you sense God is calling you to do? And I just put it in their hearts and their minds that God was calling them to something. And I couldn't tell them what it was. They had to find that out from God. But when you ask those kind of questions, it starts making people think, well, I was just going to try to find a job that paid the most money. It didn't really cross my mind that I needed to actually just find out what God was calling me to do. So that's point number one, is just everybody's called.
Yeah.
And as pastors, you need to constantly be asking people, what is God's calling on your life? What has He called you to do? But second, business people and professionals are going to touch a lot of people that pastors are not. Churches, of course, always they tend to mistakenly assume, well, the pastor is going to do the evangelism in the church, and he knows the Bible so well, and he's so good at sharing the gospel that we're just really praying. We hope to get a young pastor that can just evangelize a lot of young couples and get a bunch of people in our church. But the fact is that business people, professionals, every workday, they go into the workplace and they rub shoulders with all kinds of people that a pastor is not going to come in contact with. And so if we're expecting the pastor to do all the evangelism, all the outreach, when he's in a church office on Monday morning, he's not rubbing shoulders with a whole lot of lost people. There may be some that he'll see for sure, but most of the people that work with you in your office, your pastor is never going to cross paths with.
Right.
He's not next door neighbors with them. He doesn't go into your workroom. He doesn't have a cubicle next to yours in the workplace. And so that means you've got to be the one that's equipped to do that. And so if I were a pastor, I would map out where all my people work. I would get a city map and I would mark out what office buildings do I have a church member in? What streets do we have church members on? Is the salt and light of our congregation spending their week? What streets are we touching? Maybe we need to start a Bible study in that office building where I've got 3 of my church members there all week, and begin to ask yourself, where does this church just naturally touch? How many neighbors? If we just thought about the neighbors on either side and across the street from our church members, how many households are we touching in some way? How many businesses do we have at least one of our members associated with? And then how many clients, how many customers are we touching from one of our members? And before long, you start to realize, wow, our little church has quite a touch every week. I've got to be equipping those church members to be salt and light every time they encounter someone along the way.
Well, and that, as a pastor, I would imagine that really informs the way that you preach as well. So if now when you're looking out at your congregation, I had lunch with this person in their workplace, and I saw what this person does day in and day out in the hospital, and I think that can really shape the sort of preaching that a pastor would do, and even just the topics that you're going to cover, because now you see, hey, these are the things that my people are dealing with on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's so important for a pastor. That's just another one of the points is that pastors need to be equipping the saints. Ephesians 4, verse 12 says, the reason God gives pastors and apostles and various offices in the church is not so that they can go out and do all the work, but their job is to equip the saints, basically the lay people, for them to do the work of ministry and to build up the body of Christ. And so the focus needs to be on, so what is it my people need? What is it they don't know? What is it they don't know how to do? What is it they're facing? What problems are eating their lunch right now that I need to equip them for? And I think all of our preaching and teaching certainly needs to be biblical. It needs to be Christ-centered, but it needs to be applicable to our people's actual lives. And that's always been a problem for some pastors, because a lot of pastors, and I would say myself included, I put myself through college by working in some pretty tough work environments, but that was a long time ago, and I did it as a summer job, just earning tuition money. But that wasn't really my career. I didn't spend decades in that field, and yet I'm trying to preach and teach and equip people for lives that I've never lived myself. And so I've got to become familiar with that. I've got to talk with them. I need to sit down with them and say, what are your biggest challenges each week as you work in a very secularized workplace, and maybe your boss is kind of leans toward being hostile toward Christianity, and so what pressures do you face every day, and how are you being forced or pressured to compromise your Christian values and morals? I've shared before about a guy that was in my church that he didn't normally drink alcohol, but his boss, every time he closed a deal with a new big customer, wanted to seal it with a drink, and he would stare, a stare of knives at his employee, like, don't act rude and offend this guy by refusing to drink with him. And this guy he had a personal value of not drinking, which is fine, but then his moral value, his stand, his convictions were put on the table every time there was a new deal. And so when I realized that, here we are praying for him to advance in his career and be successful, but to be successful means you've got to do things the way that your non-Christian boss wants you to do them. Then now they've got to decide, do I care about my career, or do I care more about just not compromising myself? Do I need to find another place to work, even if I have to take a step back, take a cut in pay? Do I just kind of suck it up until I get the position I want, and then do I start trying to maybe live more to my values? And lots of really tough questions that a typical pastor might never have faced themselves, but so how do they know how to equip their people to do that?
Yeah.
Unless they've talked to them and they understand what they're going through. And maybe just one or two others just for the break. Just also, I just do the numbers. There are just far more lay people than there are pastors. So, and so
if
God,
your church is made up of primarily of pastors,
yeah,
that might be a red flag.
You've got some other problems. And so, where should your focus be if the majority of your people are not pastors, they're not seminary trained, they're working people, lay people, professionals? Well, then obviously God made a lot more of them than he made clergy. So he must have a purpose for them, and it must be an important purpose because there's a lot of them out there, and they touch a lot of people. So, and I think just kind of coupled with that, one other truth, and that is that everybody has been given the Great Commission. And I've touched on this before already, but God didn't give the Great Commission just to train professional ministers. Every person is challenged to be making disciples of all nations. And so that means every working person has a responsibility and accountability to be making disciples of other people, and not just in their city, but in the world. We're told to make disciples of all nations. So that means lay people need to be also equipped to go on mission trips and how to be involved worldwide. And so that means that we need to be doing a lot of equipping, because there's a lot of lay people, and they have the same responsibility to carry out the Great Commission as all the pastors do. So, I think we have to be careful. Sometimes the lay people just want to basically kind of say, well, I give money to the church so that we can hire pastors to do the evangelism. And that's just not valid. That's not how God has set it up. God has set up pastors so that they can equip the saints, the lay people, to do the actual heavy lifting of evangelism and missions. So if you are a lay person listening to this, you don't get an escape clause. You can't just give a little bit extra to the missions offering and say, okay, I've fulfilled my obligation to be a missionary-minded person here. No, you're obligated to be making disciples and touching the world yourself. And that's a huge assignment, and you're going to need help. You're going to need equipping. And so hopefully your church is going to be there to do that for you.
Yeah. Well, this has been really good so far, and I'm excited to come back after the break and see what else we have. Richard will be speaking at the Bill Graham Training Center at the Cove, just outside of Asheville, May 15th through the 17th on the ways of God. This is going to be a fantastic seminar, and the lodging at the Cove has already been filled, and so you can join a wait list if you want to stay at the Cove. There are other options. You can stay nearby, find your own accommodations. You can also still register for meals at the Cove. You can also just register to attend only the sessions. So there are still options. So we just want to encourage you to go ahead and book your travel if you intend to be there at the Cove. And we hope to see you all there. As always, all this information can be found at the links in the description and at thecove.org. Well, Richard, as we've said already in this podcast, that this is, I think, just such a greatly needed discussion to have. I think there is such a great divide, really, in churches between, the professional Christians, let's call them, and the lay people. And I think bridging that gap, bringing those two together, helping lay people understand their calling in the world, and helping pastors understand the people that they're preaching to. And so maybe in just the few minutes we've got left here, what are some other areas that both lay people and ministers can be focusing on?
Yeah, well, I think another one, and I think this is really important, I think that the great untapped resource in most churches is the people in the pew, the lay people that come faithfully each week, because they come, they're not just there so that they can teach a Sunday school class at the church, or they can serve on a church committee, or to give money in the offering plate. But I think what's really missed is we've got a lot of lay people that are coming every week who have got all kinds of skills that the local church desperately needs. Some of these business guys are entrepreneurs. They have a knack for seeing possibilities that other people don't see, potential. And yet the church, perhaps between 70 and 80% of churches right now in America are not growing. They're at best they're holding their own and just flatlining and plateaued. But you've got a bunch of you have a bunch of entrepreneurs in your church who are great at seeing possibilities. But all we want them to do is hand out some bulletins at the back of the church or serve on a committee somewhere, when we need to be tapping into their entrepreneurial spirit and saying, look around this church, look at the needs in society. How could our church be meeting some of those needs, and get their entrepreneurial minds rolling there so that they start to see possibilities for the church as well. A lot of these business guys are visionaries. They can grab hold of really exciting futures for their company, and yet there's a whole lot of churches right now who desperately need a bigger vision than simply surviving, simply holding on. And these business guys are problem solvers, and churches are full of problems right now. But we often leave that to the pastor, maybe some of the elders or deacons, to solve the problems. But you've got a bunch of people in the pews, they're doing that all week long, and yet we don't bring them in to help us with the church. Sometimes we kind of feel like, well, they're not a pastor, they wouldn't understand. And yet it's clear just by the current state of the church that pastors alone are not figuring it out. They need to tap into these problem solvers sitting in their pews. And business leaders often are unifiers. I mean, they don't want fragmented companies. They know if a company is going a dozen different directions that they're going to not be profitable. And so they're spending all week long unifying a diverse workforce and staff. And then they come to church, and the church is all divided, and we sort of are just leaving that on the pastor's shoulders to kind of figure out. A lot of the business guys I work with are kind of higher-end business guys, but they often travel, and they have international contacts, and they can enter into countries that missionaries aren't allowed into, pastors aren't allowed to come into. But these guys, I've literally known folks that gave Bibles to Muslims and did it as a kind of a cultural gift. Here from the West, here's a gift I want to give to you that kind of reflects on the Western country that I come from. And whereas a missionary, if they were to do that, they'd be thrown in jail or killed. So all the possibilities internationally are enormous if we tap into places that our lay people are going and traveling. And of course, lay people are great at logistics. They've got to figure out how to supply chains and marketing and staffing and taxes and payroll and increased cost of living and so on. They're constantly doing the math and figuring out how to make businesses successful. And we need a lot of that thinking in the church today as well. And just some of the lay people are great people of faith, but we're not tapping into that when it comes just to how the church is to be run. And so if I were a pastor, I would be exegeting my people. Who is it, God, that you've given us? What skills have you brought in the church door through these people? Boy, they're knocking it out of the park in their business all week long. How do we tap into that for the church as well? And of course, the church needs to be done God's ways, not necessarily the world's ways, but a lot of those skills and abilities transfer right over. And I think that's one of the great losses in so many churches is that I just know from the business guys I work with that a lot of them would love the opportunity, the invitation to bring their skill sets into their church and be given the freedom to really use those to the glory of God. And too many times pastors actually feel threatened by skilled business people and church members rather than seeing them getting excited about the possibilities that come with them. And then just want to maybe last things. There used to be maybe 20 years ago just a very, very small number of marketplace ministries. And it just kind of reflected the fact that traditionally churches just people didn't think about the fact that God was using business people for his kingdom. And so it was quite unusual. It was hard to find a group like that. But now there are literally thousands of organizations that work with business people, Christians, and equip them. And I'm privileged to work with a number of those. The CEO Forum is probably the biggest one that reaches out to the highest level of business leader, but Fellowship of Companies for Christ International, FCCI, is one for business owners. And they meet, they have meetings around the country, and they have an annual meeting that I've spoken at a number of times. Some of the cohort peer groups like C12 and Convene, you have an opportunity, if you're a business person, to meet with 11 other guys, 11 other people that are similar to you once a month, and having some mentoring as well from the chair, the leader of that group, and lots and lots of great organizations. I could list just a number, and there's a lot that are kind of local, where business people in certain regions or cities are banding together. And the whole idea is just to get other Christian business leaders, professionals together, and then encourage one another and have meetings to talk about how God wants to work through us. And so if you are a business person, I would encourage you, look around your city. There's if it's any size city at all, I'm pretty sure that there's some chapters, some branches of some of these organizations around. And I've been privileged to speak at many of them over the years, and lots of really quality people that have a real vision for how God can use business people, professionals for his kingdom. And you'll be blessed to be a part of that. And I would just really encourage you to make that a priority, to fit that in your schedule.
And that's really been, I think, a cornerstone of your dad's and your ministry.
Yeah.
I think all throughout it has been a real emphasis on, God in the marketplace, and there's a great book by the same name that you and your dad put together. And so I think that is just it's a very ripe field for God's activity.
Yeah, and we might put a link to that book, God in the Marketplace, but it's just a book that my dad and I wrote years ago, just kind of highlighting about 45 of the questions that we were regularly being asked by business people, and some of and for the CEO Forum that I work with, you have to be a pretty high-end CEO to belong to that group. So you couldn't necessarily qualify for that group, at least, to sit in the room. But we wrote a lot of that information down in that book, God in the Marketplace, so that anybody could read it and benefit from just the teaching that we offer in those gatherings. Maybe just two last things here, just in the last minute or so. One is a word to the business leaders that we've given before, and that is don't abandon the church. I know sometimes it can be frustrating because business leaders they're into efficiencies. They know that inefficiency costs them money, costs them customers, market share. They don't the stock value. They hate waste. They hate inefficiencies, and then they come to their church, and their church often is not run well, efficiently, fruitfully, and so their sin gets in the church, and there's division and all kinds of things going on. Oftentimes, poor leadership, and so it's just more fulfilling to just pour yourself into your work than to endure a poorly run church. But don't abandon the church. As we often say, God doesn't have plan B. The church is God's method for taking the gospel around the world. And so as a professional and a business person, you want to be a part of a church. And hopefully you can bring your skills and abilities to your local church and help it be better. Ask yourself, well, God took me to this church. Is there some skill that I have that could help my church be the church that God wants it to be? Mm-hmm. And then maybe take your pastor to lunch and say, listen, I'm not trying to be the pastor. I'm not trying to take over your job. I just want my church to be the best version it can possibly be of itself, and I want to help. And so find a way to be a blessing. And maybe just on the heels of that, the last thing is just don't get out of your lane. And you want to support your pastor. You want to be, perhaps you might even be invited into a committee or leadership board or elder, but if God's made you a lay person, then don't try to act like you're the pastor. I've known some lay people that they really believe they could do a better job of being a pastor than their pastor, and that's usually a recipe for a lot of conflict and disunity. If God's made you a business leader, an entrepreneur, then do that with gusto. Do that to the glory of God. Bring your skills to the church and offer them as an offering to God, but be a blessing to your church leaders, not a curse, not a rival. If God wanted you to run the church, he would have called you to be a pastor, but he put you in the marketplace. And so I've always, since I left being a pastor, and I'm not a business professional, but I'm a nonprofit leader. Any church I'm in, I want to find a place where I can use my gifts to bless my church. But I don't intend to be the pastor. I don't intend to. I know that where my lane is, right, at least for now. And so while I'm in a different lane, I want to stay in that lane and do a good job there. But I do want to be a blessing to whatever church I'm a part of. And so let me just encourage our listeners, if you're a pastor, I suspect that there is a lot of untapped resources waiting for you. And it's not just that they write you a check, but that they bring their skills, abilities, insights, and you need to tap into those. And you need to not feel threatened by your gifted, talented lay people, but set them loose. And I'll tell you what exciting things can happen. And if you're a business person, pray for your pastor and staff, bless them, and just put every skill, ability, contact, resource you have on the altar for God, and let God show you how perhaps things he's built into your life, your business, are exactly what your church needs as well. And then give it wholeheartedly to the glory of God.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Richard, and I thank you for it. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.